Warning, this podcast contains violence, sexuality, gore, and other horrible and disturbing things. Listener discretion is advised. Also, the hosts of this venture are ignorant dipshits, so please do not take anything they say as fact. And enjoy the show.
Now, are you sitting comfortably? Good. Then we'll begin.
Today we had 15 homicides and 63 violent crimes, as if that's the way it's supposed to be.
It is our basic human right to be fuck-up.
A second plane now has crashed into the other tower of the World Trade Center.
Putting chemicals in the water that turn the friggin' frogs gay.
The defendant shall be incarcerated for the rest of her natural life with no possibility of parole.
You are not machines. You are not cattle. You are men.
We were somewhere around Barstow, on the edge of the desert, when the drugs began to take hold.
Occultae Veritatis.
With silver you can turn your dreams to gold. Oh, we're in the money. We're in the money. We've got a lot of what it takes to get along.
In the marketplace of ideas, thinkers of all sort peddle their wares. Academics, researchers, teachers, leaders, innovators, disruptors. Some rigorously research and review the ramifications of their ideas before taking them to the market, while others, seeking profit, rapidly scale ideas without holistic consideration for the people and communities they should be serving. A long time ago, someone had an idea. What if I can own something that I don't use because other people with power agree that I own it? And then I can demand that the people who will use it have to pay me. This is the birth of capitalism. Let's have some poison.
Ooh, I got
that was
chills.
some chilly.
Yeah.
I was just like, wow.
So, what's your poison?
This is a honey soda. I made some simple honey syrup, so it's equal parts honey and water. Heated until it becomes a nice syrup. It's very liquidy syrup. And then added club soda to make it.
That is a drink that has a full, initial and completely different aftertaste. Like when it first hits you, it almost tastes like pear. Like it's very sweet. And the aftertaste is... What the fuck is the aftertaste?
Honey,
right.
Thanks, Sage.
Real homegrown, made in Saskatchewan honey, by the way.
It's like sucking on a honey candle.
No, like one of those honey sips.
What the fuck's a honey candle?
Oh yeah, honey sticks.
Like honeycomb candles.
Yeah.
Beeswax.
Whatever.
I've made a few honey syrups before. I'm not entirely settled on what the ratio of honey to water should be. You can also make honey syrups out of SASKATOON berry. But I think it's important that we're going to be talking about communities, and bees are maybe a really good example for
the monarchy. No, just kidding.
No, it's about everyone working together for the goals of the community rather than seeking their own
Sounds communist.
Sounds like some commie bullshit to me.
I'm clearly you're going to get from this episode that I'm totally anti-communism.
Can you send me the recipe for this situation?
It's very good. It's good. I mean, it tastes exactly like you would expect. Not bad. It's good.
I'm obsessed with it.
It's fucking ridiculous.
I'll get you a recipe.
Yeah,
maybe that can be also on the Patreon if necessary.
Yeah. Oh,
yes, that's a good idea. Look at you. You're fucking so much smarter than us.
Yeah. We didn't introduce ourselves during the poison, and that's fine. Welcome to Occultae Veritatis. I'm Bambi. This is my podcast, and in studio with me I have
Sage Murray,
Leon Filger,
Ood Gallifrey,
Richard Bigley,
the soundboard demon,
and
SASKATOON.
And they said to the king, we'll pay you taxes, but you have to set up a place where we get to talk about what we want to be done with the taxes. And the place where we want to talk is called a place where, to use the French word, parler, where we speak, is called a parliament, where you go to speak. And who speaks? The capitalists to the king. We want our share of what goes on. The king needed the taxes in order to run the big system that he was the king of. So he had to kind of meet them halfway, although he wasn't happy about it. And we begin to get the capitalists with their own political party fighting against the king and the lord and struggling over power, because it turned out these two systems didn't live together real well. This kind of tension builds up across the later part of feudalism until the capitalists are strong enough in the cities where they are based, have enough serfs that they begin to demand that the policies of the king be tilted less towards feudalism, more towards capitalism. But that threatens the feudals, because they need that king to protect them, and they don't want to support a capitalism. We know where this story ends. It ends in the French Revolution, when the new emerging merchants, employers in the cities with their employees realize that the future is theirs and that they need to end this struggle by ending the feudalism, and they make revolutions to do so. And that's how capitalism is born. It's born first within the shell of an old feudalism, coming out of the contradictions of that feudalism, making those contradictions, not intentionally, but by their very growth, more acute, struggling now for their own political organizations, to have their own political force and power on the feudal kings, forcing slowly, with much conflict, compromises and concessions from that king until they're strong enough to push feudalism aside historically and bring the world into the newer arrangement of capitalism, replacing lord and serf system with employer-employee system. Why am I telling you this story? Because inside capitalism, the same thing is now happening, a parallel story. What's happening are worker co-ops in Spain, in France, in Germany, but now in the United States and everywhere. Workers are saying we don't want to live in the way capitalism assigns us. It's too unequal. It's too unstable with its every 4 to 7 year downturns. It's not a bearable system. We are looking for alternatives and finding them in starting up our own collective businesses.
Humans are inherently communal. Communities have always had hierarchical systems. The reality is that not everyone wants to be in charge and bear responsibility for decisions that impact everyone in their community. And sometimes leaders are thrust into their positions, but for the most part, we see people self-selecting as leaders, for better or for worse. Up until very recently, the leaders of communities were directly responsible to the members of their communities. If the king was unpopular enough, there were enough people to storm the castle and solve that problem. The power to select leaders inherently was held by the united power of the members of a community. Communities of old were not typically formed of people with a common set of values, as we might think of communities today, whether that's a community of people who are big fans of a specific TV show or set of fiction.
Fans of a podcast.
Yeah.
Communities were typically formed based on largely geography and specifically due to a common scarcity. The earliest communities were rooted in security, the collection of resources, and the coordination of labor.
And it was more equitable back then, wasn't it?
Well, yes, to a degree. The main thing being, because of the nature of scarcity, like the potential for you to have so much more than someone else, and especially in times when you couldn't just have a balance in a bank. If you were wealthy, financially wealthy, you had gold somewhere. And you had to protect that. You had to pay people to protect that. And if you didn't pay them enough, they would take your gold and kill you and you'd be dead.
Yeah.
And in other situations, you would have, the leader of a town has the biggest house, the nicest house, but it's not that big of a step. And that person, if he wants to go talk to the king, he still has to physically, get in a horse or a carriage, go to wherever the king is, petition before, the communication structures and the resources and everything made it more difficult for inequity. And of course, those people, the leaders, relied constantly on a lot of people doing things to maintain supply chains and look out for all of that stuff. So, leaders had to rely quite heavily on the support of members of the community, even if there were communities that were supporters of a leader who would then be, provisioned such to oppress other people, or things like that. That was definitely, and has always been a thing. Slavery goes back a long time.
Oh, yeah.
And that was always, one group of people with power executing it against others.
But if the mayor of your town wasn't doing what the town folks want, like he had a bigger house, he had a nicer house, but a lot of people, it'd be easier to riot against and burn. And if he had gold in the basement, you could steal it, and so much for the mayor.
Yeah.
Feudalism is really a way of looking at sort of the macro developments of economics, of how society was organized from the highest levels to the lowest social levels. It is a system of social organization in medieval European society based upon personal ties of loyalty between socially unequal individuals who exchange services for other services and goods. It's how people interacted in relationship to each other. And it's a unequal relationship, that it's not an equal making a deal with another equal, but rather it is a social superior making arrangements, economic, social arrangements with their social inferiors. Each party will get something out of the deal. And ultimately, what characterizes feudalism is that there is no central authority. That in a feudal society, it is largely predicated upon local autonomy and kings that may have a lot of authority but have very little power. So a failing centralized system and very powerful local elites characterize feudalism generally. Society is organized within this feudalistic system, and it's hierarchical relationships and how people agree to do services for one another in a non-monetarized economy. A society that is entirely agricultural. It has no money. It's very difficult to trade. It's very difficult to sell things when there is no money in a society, or very, very little money in a society. That's effectively just a barter economy. Those who were working the land, or the vast majority of them, were these poor peasants, and they gave over their autonomy of owning their own lands and things like that. So when we say feudalism, it comes from the word ad feudum, which is a type of land ownership, which is what we would call a fief, which is a piece of land. So a land owner, someone who had personal property ownership, let's say a lord, gives a grant of land to a vassal. So this is a social inferior. And the lord grants this land ad feudum. So it means they get the land for the use during their lifetime, and then this land will escheat. It will revert back to the lord at the time of the vassal's death. And this land was then used for this vassal to be able to have enough money to serve as a military soldier for the lord.
In the early Middle Ages, in Europe and Great Britain, a system developed under which a central village would have ownership of the lands around it. The lands nearer the village, and specifically the arable lands near the village, would be divided into usually 2 to 5 larger fields, which would be subdivided into furlongs. And the land farther from the village, which could include forest and other non-arable stretches of land, would be used as collective grazing lands. This area was called the waste, although it did not carry the implications that we might think of it today.
Yeah, because that sounds like the place in the RPG where you need to be level 5 to get into.
The furlongs of the inner fields would be assigned to members of the community who would hold them privately and make decisions about how they would be cultivated. But there was no disconnection between one furlong to the next. Usually there would be indicators marked with a trench or different ways depending on the area. This was a deeply non-standardized system. But you would have your furlong and your neighbor would have another furlong beside it and all, so on and so forth. All of the land in this field would be owned by members of the community, including the lord who might report to the king or whatever, if that was the case. A member of the community who was assigned land would be assigned furlongs in each field, so that they would always have at least one plot that was workable, because the community would agree on years that each field would be left fallow, and the herds would be allowed to roam and graze in them. The main thing being, you can't just constantly farm out land, it'll go bad. And also, there will be stuff left in the field that the animals can graze on, and their poop will then act as fertilizer, so you want them kind of going through that land. But if you are a member of a community, and the field has been left fallow, the herds are allowed in there, but you've decided that you're going to plant potatoes this year, your plants are going to get eaten, and your potatoes aren't going to turn out. Now, it's important to understand that the system, which we call the open field system, did not have a name at the time and was not standardized beyond the core tenets that I've laid out. There could be significant variation in the operation of a village using the system based upon their needs as a community, the supply of labor, the nature of geography, and many other aspects. The biggest point of variation that I haven't touched on was the governance structure. The main thing about the governance structures is that they varied dramatically. And the big thing is, like, a lot of them were, as we've kind of described, the lord with a mandate from the king to sort of govern a town, but who did not have ownership over the property. Like, it was not private property, it was the town's property. And in other cases, there were, like, villages that came together. It was a bunch of people who were co-equal, at least at the start, and then more people would show up and they'd be like, okay, yeah, you can work for us, but you aren't necessarily going to own land and stuff like that. In any case, the members of the community needed to come together to make decisions about how they would operate. They could not do it on their own, because the nature of your furlongs being separated into different fields and your herds relying heavily on the community, like wastes, and then also the ability to graze on the fallow fields, you could not back out without leaving your land behind. You couldn't work your land without the support of the community. And you also, in a lot of cases, especially later on, the plows became heavier. And so you were able to plow more effectively if you were able to use this heavier plow, but it required, instead of 1 or 2 oxen to operate, you would have to have a team of 8. Most people didn't have a team of 8, but they would have 1 or 2 oxen. So if they work with a bunch of their friends who are part of their community, they could all work together to pull the heavier and more effective plows. So basically, the premise is, even if you owned private land, as far as the furlongs within the inner fields, you didn't have the right to do anything with it that you wanted. You could sell your land, or maybe you couldn't, depending on whether that was allowed or not. But you could not completely freely decide what to do with it. You could not build structures on it, because it would, for at least during the off-season, would be allowed for grazing. You were not allowed to do a whole bunch of things with it. And you would starve if you just took your oxen along and didn't have a field and didn't have any crops growing or anything. And that is one of the points that kind of comes around to corollaries in the present day, which we're looking back into a time when communication was slower and resources were slower and people had to rely on each other because they had to. They didn't really have a choice. But to get to where we are now, we had to go through a process by which technology changed pretty dramatically. I think that the last open field farm in the United Kingdom is currently figuring out a way to change how they're administered, because there are too few people to be part of it, actually make it self-sustaining. So the last one exists and has existed for a long time. There have been others that have been enclosed, which is a term I'll get to in a second, over the past 100 years or so, and during the 1800s, the 19th century. In about 1750, there was a record that showed that about 50% of the arable land in England was being cultivated in what we would identify as an open field system. 50% of it wasn't, and a lot of land never was governed under this kind of structure. But there was a process that started happening. And some of it was related to when a bunch of people died of the plague, they didn't have the labor to maintain all of their farms. So they had to find ways of maintaining their livelihoods that did not rely on more people to get those economies of scale. There were also changes in how trade was happening, where, the age of sail, the golden age of sail started happening. The Dutch East India Company and a lot of additional international trade, as well as regional trade within Europe, started increasing dramatically. And there was a point where the price of wool, if you were cultivating sheep for wool, you would be able to sell your wool for a huge profit and then buy all the food that you needed, for sure. This was a point where the scarcity was less of a problem, and you were able to buy food rather than produce it yourself. The villagers that were just part of this and co-equal kind of citizens decided to enclose some of their land, and the process of enclosure, which could happen in any structure of governance, is basically the idea that you take some of that arable land and you enclose it, literally build a field around it, probably for sheep or other livestock or some specific purpose. And it is now not collectively owned by everyone because it is fenced off. It is easier to say that this fenced off area belongs to Lord Go Fuck Himself of Fuck Yourself Shire.
And he controlled what happened on that land.
Yes. So the control of that land became one person's right to decide rather than the community's responsibility to decide.
And people would pay for use of that land.
If that was an option. If you had sheep, maybe you would be able to pay rents. In a lot of cases, it was straight up, you were cut out of that area. You no longer had access to that area for production. And that would limit your productivity as a farmer because now you've got a whole bunch of sheep taking up a bunch of what was your land.
You do right to do this. Leave them animals be. This is the common land.
Any man who raises a hand against the king's men will be arrested. You have no right to do this. This land is ours. Well, now it belongs to the Earl of Manchester. By whose authority? By the authority of the king. Then I say the king is a thief. You're under arrest. Take him away. Bastards!
Let him go. What he does, he's done nothing.
Release that man. Who the devil are you? This man works for me. Whatever he has done, I will take full responsibility. He has spoken treason against the king. Will you take responsibility for that? The rights to pasture belong to the common people. By what authority, Lord Manchester, do you take that away? By the authority of His Majesty's commissioners, granting me and my friends full rights to this land for the purpose of improvement.
So the process of enclosure took a long time. It did not move very quickly to start because even like Parliament in England opposed it. They thought it was a bad idea because it didn't benefit them directly, I guess. But as times changed, they pushed more and more, and more of the people who owned some private land wanted to own more. And I didn't want to like nitpick into a bunch of specific. I know there are cases of basically what we would identify as like a cooperative or an agrarian co-op kind of thing, workers co-ops forming and then being physically pushed out by like military forces in Europe and England. But the main thing about it, like we start looking at the Industrial Revolution, everyone was flocking to the cities, we say. And the reason they were flocking to the cities is because they had physically been pushed off of their farmland. In some cases, I'm sure some people would have gone to the cities as opportunities were arising. But you have this displacement of workers and a loss of the right of ownership because now people are saying, see that plot of land? That's mine because these 500 people with spears say so. And if you disagree, you're going to get to meet my 500 friends with spears.
Libertarian paradise. Yeah.
So the long and short of it, like the birth of capitalism came about over the course of about 500 years between like the 1300s and into the Industrial Revolution. But the main thing is, as we start looking at capitalism and the private ownership and the individual, the dawn of the individual, because prior to this period of time where people were owning private property, and it started with obviously the people who already had access to wealth being able to enclose and demand exclusive rights over a specific plot of land. That began to expand and it became much more accessible to fairly common people. And they started trying to sell this idea, and apparently it worked, that, oh, you're an enterprising young man, go out and work hard, come up with an idea, you can be rich and you can oppress a bunch of other people to work for you. And that's kind of like, that's the tagline of capitalism. That's what they're trying to pitch to you.
Yeah, the American dream.
But what we're seeing now, and I think that this was always going to be a problem, but it became the nature of the problem changed when we got into a period of digital technology and the speed of our communication and the amount that we can be commodified has changed pretty dramatically. It is not a question of trying to take individuals and give one individual the opportunity to be the hero of the day. The object now is to take a bunch of people who are in a community and dissolve the strength of that community to create the vulnerability necessary to profit off of you. Our value to capitalism is not in the individualism in the sense that we might have some great idea that we're going to be able to take to the market and create some new value and generate a lot of profit. Our value as individuals is that we can be divided and isolated. When we don't have a community to support us, we have to pay for everything that we want to trust. And that is how people will profit off of us. That is what capitalism does.
In the early times, if you weren't happy with the mayor, you could collect together with your fellow town people and take some torches to his house and demand what you want. But as we become more isolated and as our societies become more fractured, it's becoming harder and harder to collect and demand action. A lot of what we want could be gained with one general strike. Everybody striking, all workers striking and grinding a country to a halt until our demands are met. Rights have been got from things like that before, but it's so hard to get everybody on board when they're just drained by capitalism and they're caught in a system where they have to keep on working and working and working. And who has time for protests and strikes when you're just trying to survive?
Well, and you factor in even like these past few years with social distancing and isolating and remote everything. That gathering power has recently been diminished, and I think that there's a lot of, activist organizations out there that are only now trying to like rediscover or relearn how to engage people again, how to get them together. And I mean, a lot of people are still even hesitant to go out, even though the rest of the, like COVID's still there. It still exists, whether there's a pandemic or not, and there's people who don't want to go out, don't want to gather.
Mm-hmm.
And so to have any sort of mass collective action takes a lot to make that happen, such as, like the Black Lives Matter protests. But I mean, other than that exception.
And like at the same time, I think that's a really good example. Even like we can look at pre-pandemic organizing and the things like Occupy Wall Street, things that could be the tools related to organizing digitally. We had an opportunity before the pandemic to cultivate communities and develop tools that we could use to have strong communities that are less constrained by physical boundaries. And we still have that opportunity. We kind of missed the boat on getting it in before COVID and the negative impact that COVID had on when people were isolating and the difficulties that everyone had and the mental health issues stemming from that. And also like things like when we look at like labor organizing, now we're kind of in a, like everyone's economically post-pandemic as far as most people are concerned. And the movements towards unionization have been continuing to increase.
If unions were a patient in hospital, how would you diagnose their current health given those numbers?
Well, I guess it depends on whether or not we want to say they're stable or maybe a little peaked, a little pale. I think there's, some truth to both of those diagnoses, right? I mean, you saw from the graph that really from the late 1990s, union density, unionization rate, hasn't really gone down very much. It's stayed around the 30% mark, up and down a little bit over those years. It's down from its high, but there is a lot of stability in union representation in Canada. But there is a reality that the labor movement is centered now in the public sector, right? 70% of the public sector is unionized. It means that a majority of union members are now in the public sector. It also, interestingly, means a majority of union members are women for quite a significant amount of time. And that's a good news story, but it also makes me very alarmed because the weakness in the private sector is a crisis, not just for workers in the private sector who need union representation, but for the labor movement as a whole and for Canadian society as a whole.
Unfortunately, in Ontario, we're actually seeing a clawback to things like health and safety legislation, where sadly, just recently in Ajax, we had a worker killed on the job on a roof. And this is just, last month. And this is happening all the time in today's day and age. Workers are going to work and not coming home because they're dying on the job. So they're just as relevant from the health and safety perspective. And unions are there to help facilitate these working conditions and make sure that people go to work safely and come home safely.
Let's find out from a guy who's actually trying to do that, trying to unionize. Thanks for your patience, Ivan.
So what I would say is, for example, I'm an organizer just organizing bike couriers in Toronto, Foodora bike couriers, yet CUPW, the Union of Postal Workers, is supporting us. they had a huge rally where I was shown so much support from these postal workers whose jobs, in a sense, don't really have anything to do with my struggle. So really what that shows me is that people understand that these issues go across Canadian society. And they see that, when other workers are being taken advantage of, that brings everyone down. So it's actually advantageous for everyone to support other workers in their precarious conditions, regardless of how close together they are. Something like my job, I feel like I'm almost back in 1919. That's why, this is so important to someone like me. I meet bike couriers every day who are injured on the job.
How dangerous is your job?
Really dangerous. I think it's more dangerous than being a police officer or a construction worker or a fireman, because we simply don't have any of the protections or respect that those professions get.
If you are successful in your drive to have a union represent you and your fellow cyclists, couriers, how will that change your life?
Drastically. I mean, we could argue that we deserve adequate safety and protections. I mean, we could get health benefits that, people in the office get, yet people who work in the streets doing the dangerous labor don't get. We have no say right now in how we're paid. Meanwhile, inflation goes up, cost of living goes up in Toronto, rent goes up. So we're kind of in a downward spiral right now, and the only answer to that I can see is labor stepping up and speaking out for their issues, which is a union.
There have been a couple of high-profile ones. I know Starbucks unionization in the States. There were a couple of, I can't remember where they were, but a couple of Starbucks in the States unionized. That's continuing to be an option that workers are beginning to understand. But it's not like someone else's job to keep that movement going. That's inherently, it is our job to do it. We are part of that community. Or whatever communities we are part of, it is our job to continue to cultivate them. We don't get to just click on Netflix and be part of that community. It takes more work than just consuming to be part of a community.
I watched Community on Netflix.
It's a good show.
It looks like I just derailed.
I like your explanation of community quite a bit, and it's given me time to reflect on what communities can look like, which is not necessarily for example, a city. Like the queer community in Saskatoon has got its own set of priorities and desires, and the chess playing community in Saskatoon, which is very strong, has got their own aims and desires. And it's just it's pretty cool to consider the intersectionality of various communities that we all find ourselves in. We're in a community because of the podcast. This is largely how we know each other nowadays, but Bigley and I had community in Air Cadets way back in the day, and Oud Gallifrey had the Air Cadet community back in the day, and yet I've known Sage for 16 years,
something like that. Yeah.
Just through the progressive community, and I've met you through that community, and you've now got me doing more high profile things within communities. It's a good topic and a good episode.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think it is important, reframing community and understanding we are not necessarily geographically constrained. We are literally still we still need to understand that there is a community of the neighborhood that we live in, the city that we live in, the province that we live in, the country that we live in. There's a community there, and some communities are quite fractured right now. Some communities that are going to exist because of an inherent truth, like a geographic community, are in real peril, where there's an opportunity for engagement to try to unify people more.
The Sunni and the Shiites.
That's right.
If they could sort that out, that'd be great in my lifetime. I don't think they will, but
a lot of these issues are connected. The fight against capitalism, the fight for more environmental stewardship, the fight against racism, the fight for communities, all these things are intricately linked, and they lean one upon each other, so that if one is affected, they're all affected. And being reminded that the fight against bigotry and racism and building community is the same fight as against capitalism and against, like, polluting our earth and causing climate change. Like, it's all part of the same fight. And I think that any of those endeavors that you're going after will produce good results.
Oh, you're a capitalist, are you then? Where's your capital?
Capitalism also has always had, like feudalism, moments when it broke down, when for whatever complex of reasons, people didn't connect to each other as employer and employee, which is the core relationship of capitalism, just like lord and serf was the core relationship of feudalism. Let me give you just a few examples. The Shakers, that religious community in early United States, they didn't relate to one another as employer and employee. You know how they related? In the way we nowadays call worker co-ops. All the people in a Shaker village got together and decided, one person, one vote, how to produce, what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, what to do with the fruits of their labor. No employer-employee. That was a socialist experiment, if you like, going beyond capitalism. But the conditions weren't right for that to spread. It spread a little, but it couldn't become the dominant system. Let me give you another example, more modern. The Mondragon Corporation in Spain. A Catholic priest in 1956 starts a co-op. No employer-employee. We are our own bosses here, said Father Arizmendi. And here we are in 2020. And the Mondragon Corporation is one of the 10 biggest corporations in Spain. It's a family of a couple hundred worker co-ops where there are no employers over there and employees. The workers are their own bosses. Wow, that is a non-capitalist experiment that has been able to grow and last, well, 70 years. Very interesting. All these experiments, some worked, some didn't. Just like the experiments going beyond feudalism. Some worked, some just didn't. It took time for the conditions to ripen so that there could be a general transition. What really sealed the fate of feudalism was the decision and the commitment of millions of people that they thought that the employer-employee relationship was more productive, was better for most people than what lord and serf had been. The great father of modern capitalism intellectually, Adam Smith, that's what he said, that's what he wrote. Capitalism is a more productive system than feudalism. So what's beginning to happen is a recognition that what has to change, what has to be learned from the successful but also the failed experiments in transition is to focus more on the core relationship. That what has to happen is you put aside the employer-employee relationship. Just as earlier, people put aside the lord-serf. Put those aside. The new breakthrough, the new system, the better way to live and work would be if you democratize the enterprise.
Money's becoming more ethereal and metaphorical. Like when you look at the stock system and how you can bet against shorts and you can bet against money that doesn't really exist. And even things like the rise of cryptocurrency and NFTs, money and wealth and what you own is becoming more and more ethereal.
Mm-hmm. And I didn't want to specifically include things like the way that the financial markets work in my analysis of like the claim of ownership over real property.
Yeah.
But that is like a sort of the next step as we look at like the reason that the financial crisis in 2008 happened was rooted in people fucking around with where value existed and like selling investments into mortgages. And then that created an incentive to give these mortgages to people who wouldn't have been able to qualify for them, which resulted in this whole fucking housing market collapse. Which is really frustrating. Like we can look at stuff like now tech investments. Like tech startup investment and stuff like that. The whole way that they are framed towards trying to provide value to shareholders rather than to try to create a product that is valuable to people to use in the real world. Like they're completely divorced from providing something that you can use, creating a tool that is going to make it better for us to do things. People who work in healthcare or adjacent to healthcare, definitely your work feels pretty real, I guess, in most days. I work in an office. It would be really easy for me to think, like, abstract how I think about my work to the point where, like, am I doing anything that creates any value? And luckily, like, working in communications, whether or not I have communicated something is usually fairly tangible. But there are lots of other jobs that would be similarly office-based that it's easy to lose the reality of what you're doing, and you're just going in and making widgets every day, and you go home, and whether or not you did anything doesn't feel like it did anything.
Yeah.
But as we engage with the realities of this world, like I think the tech industry is going to face a reckoning soon, because it doesn't make sense to be doing the things that they're doing in investing in development and stuff like that.
Well, and I mean, if we do have any venture capitalists listening, I just do want to say that for a mere $20,000, you can get in on the ground floor for 10% of Richard Bigley Tech, and we will make the future today. Thank you. Please send me your checks for your 10% in my company. Thank you.
Yeah. If I had $20,000, I'd invest. I'm convinced.
Making the future today.
Yeah.
Tell me you don't want that.
I do. I've seen Star Trek. That seems good. I want that today.
Exactly. We'll make it today. Let's do this. Send me $20,000.
Yeah, I will. As soon as I just got to find enough nickels on the sidewalk, and I'll get there.
All right.
We aren't special. We aren't all-powerful. When we're alone, we're vulnerable. It is easy to fall victim to the despair, the isolation, and to succumb to the whims of capitalism. When we sacrifice the value of the collective in favor of privately owned solutions, we give in to the desires of people who want to own us and everything we represent. It does not have to be this way. In the modern day, with the communication tools that we have, we can coordinate more efficiently and effectively than ever in history. We can be there for each other, and we can make that choice. None of us were there when capitalism was born, but we can be there when it dies.
Yes.
Fuck yeah. Yay. Stay angry, keep learning, fight the good fight.
For Occultae Veritatis podcast, I've been Bambi.
Sage Mary.
Leon Felger.
Ood Gallifrey.
Richard Bigley.
And I'm the soundboard demon. Possibly also Richard Bigley.
And
Saskate.
This has been a hostile takeover of Occultae Veritatis podcast.
Yeah.
We love it.
Hello, OVPOD listeners and cult members. It is 2024, and it is good to be back. Hope you enjoyed that one. That's a bit of a higher brow, philosophical type episode, combining some labor rights with history, with, future hoping for better. Yeah, thanks for listening, but back to business. Playing us out this episode, entering the public domain just this year. From 1928, this is Seeger Ellis, singing, "When you're smiling, the whole world smiles with you." Enjoy, and see you next episode in 10 days.
I saw a blind man, he was a kind man, helping a fellow along. One could not see, one could not walk, but they both were humming their song. When you're smiling, the whole world smiles with you. When you're laughing, the sun comes shining through. But when you're crying, you bring on the rain, so stop your sighing. Be happy again, keep on smiling. 'Cause when you're smiling, the whole world smiles with you. When you're smiling, why the whole world smiles with you. When you're laughing, the sun comes shining through. But when you're crying, you bring on the rain, so stop your sighing. Be happy again, just keep on smiling. 'Cause when you're smiling, why the whole world keeps on smiling with you.